What is going on, guys? We are here with another video. In today's video, we are going to be creating a tier list for all of the Shadowlands dungeons. As we know, in Season 4, no new dungeons are coming in terms of Shadowlands dungeons that we've never seen before. So we've seen every single Shadowlands dungeon. Now, I understand we're going to be getting some Time Walking-esque dungeons. You know, we're getting Karazhan back, we're getting Mechagon back, and a couple WoD dungeons, but we'll talk about those later on in Season 4. But for now, we're going to go over the dungeons we've seen so far in Shadowlands. Now, on this list, Tazavesh, both Gambit and Streets are not on here, but we will be talking about them, even though there is not an actual picture. So if you want to hear my opinion on those dungeons, you'll have to wait and see to the very end. Anyway, let's get started. So you can't see because of my camera, but the other side is the first dungeon. Now, I'm personally going to put the other side in B tier. I think there's a lot going good for this dungeon, right? The bosses are generally decently good. Hakar was very overtuned at first, which is why it's down in the B tier. Hakar is like one of the worst bosses of all of Shadowlands, pre-nerfed Hakar. For the most part, you couldn't really kill him. If you didn't kill him in like 40 seconds, he would virtually become unkillable. But as a result, they did nerf him, and they made him a lot easier to deal with, and now he's a pretty decent boss to deal with. You can kill him in 20 seconds, 30 seconds, and be perfectly fine. Not 20 seconds, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and be perfectly fine. Dealer's X is still a really tough boss, but a lot of players now understand how to defeat him in the Season 3 as everything, comes to show. The final boss is an interesting one. I still personally thought that boss would not be good on like Grievous weeks, and it's not, because it just does a lot of damage, and you're out of range of your healer for the most part. I would have liked to see them force you to do like a two-phase type thing by reducing the time, right? Like he only does his combos once, then he teleports you, you kill 2 totems, you come back, he does his combo once, you teleport, kill 2 totems, something like that. Because as the meta is, it's basically 1 DPS go to each totem, and the tank and healer go. It's fine, it worked out, nothing too shabby. Now this dungeon gets carried very heavily by Season 3 affix right now. Now when it was Prideful and the other one, I don't even remember what the other seasonal affix was. This dungeon was not generally that good, especially in Prideful. You'd have to do some really weird routes in order to get Pride. The Prideful buff on every boss, not to mention you'd have to stealth through the Mechagon wing with a rogue, but the encrypted affix basically fills in every single one of those holes. Last but not least, the dungeon itself is just very long. They had to increase the timer, which is really funny. They had to add 2 minutes to the timer, which was basically required because it was just too long of a dungeon. But yeah, so it's going to be in the B tier. Halls of Atonement, in my opinion, B tier dungeon. I'm not the biggest fan of this dungeon. I know for a lot of people it is one of their favorite dungeons because it's generally an easier dungeon. As a tank player, I despise this dungeon. The bears, or the Gargons as they're actually called, do way too much damage. Blizzard, I don't understand why Blizzard had not nerfed them at all. They still haven't nerfed them to this day. They actually increased the damage that Wicked Bolt does in this dungeon, which just hurts your tanks even more. I don't know what they were doing. But there's a lot of good things going for this dungeon, right? You get 80% of your count before the first boss, which is great. The bosses aren't really that hard to deal with. The hardest boss is Echelon, the second boss, but for the most part nowadays, most groups have lust for him, whereas for the first 2 seasons, no one really had lust for him. They would always lust the first boss because you wanted to get as many lusts as you could out of the dungeon, but saving lust for Echelon basically kills him. But overall, Halls of Atonement's not a terrible dungeon. It's pretty fun to do. Yeah. The next dungeon, Mists of Turna Scythe. Now, Mist is going to be an A tier dungeon for me. There's only one thing that I hate about this dungeon, and it is the first boss. I think the first boss is very terribly designed. It makes no sense that the tree heals to full, right? Like, you're basically just doing meaningless damage because you have to deal the damage in order to actually kill the boss, but he just heals back to full. So if you don't kill the boss, you have to redo that damage. I personally would have liked to see it where you deal the damage, and whatever percentage you get the actual boss's health to is the percentage of health that the tree heals to, right? So if you get the actual boss to 50%, the boss heals to 50%. If you get the boss below 20%, he just never gets back into the tree, right? Like, that makes sense. That, you know, that would mechanically make sense, but I understand lore reasons why it worked that way. But yeah, the maze is a fun mechanic. In Mythic Plus, it does suck, but it's a great mechanic. There's not any terrible trash mobs to really deal with. You get to pull really big in the final area. Overall, really good dungeon. It's quick and easy as well. It's like an 18-minute dungeon for most groups. But yeah, pretty good. Necrotic Wake is next. Necrotic Wake is going to be my only S tier dungeon. Necrotic Wake is a pretty great dungeon. The weapons do a lot of damage. They make this dungeon extremely fast. As long as you have a Kyrian in this dungeon, you just absolutely shred everything. You just do crazy pulls with the Goliath orbs, and you just murder everything. It's really, really fun. Now, there's a lot of important interrupts to do on this dungeon, but for the most part, a single player can deal with those, whereas everyone else can just kind of interrupt whatever they want, and it could be perfectly fine. The only thing that I hate about this dungeon is the final boss, right? The final boss virtually heals for 5% of his health every like 20, 25 seconds. I think that's really bad design. He doesn't actually heal, but he gets the shield. The meta has basically shown that now you just save every weapon for that boss. They have nerfed him since then, but in Season 1 and 2, the meta was you just saved every weapon for that boss, and then you used it on him whenever a shield happened. I think people still do that to this day in the highest of keys, but that's like the only thing going wrong for this dungeon. I think you can do multiple different routes. Every tank is different. You can do so many skips. You can do whatever you want. It's a pretty good dungeon, and I honestly will be sad to see Necrotic Wake go. Plaguefall is my next dungeon. I'm going to throw Plaguefall in the A tier. I think Plaguefall pre-Plague in Season 1 and Season 2 was like a C tier dungeon. I hated how you had to deal with the Plague Boars. The strategy was you would get all the Plague Boars and use the Plague Boars to kill everything, right? I absolutely hated that strategy. But now, since they took that away and you only have, I think it's like 8 total max, Plaguefall is a great dungeon, right? You can do the dungeon any way you want. There's multiple different routes you can go. There's obviously one really the best route, but you can do whatever you want. You can press W and the dungeon will be fine. You can easily time it. You can do a whole bunch of skips and easily time it. The first boss is not the greatest, right? He just has a lot of health and does a lot of damage. You know, you're forced to have CCs as well, but he's not terrible. You just lust and nuke him and kill him. The second boss, I think the purple slime is kind of weird. I wish that didn't exist, but I understand why it does. But overall, this dungeon has not a lot of down factors. For the most part, the only reason is that it's not an S tier dungeon is just simply because of the Plague Boars and how you had to use them, and how every pug group, even at like the 15 level, like wanted you to use the Plague Boars, even though you would use it inefficiently, and if you just press W, it would have been perfectly fine. But overall, this dungeon's a pretty good dungeon. Not having a disease dispel sucks for tanks, so that's also a little down part, right? Like, your tank will just die if you don't have a disease dispel. But overall, it's a pretty good dungeon. Spires of Ascension is next. Spires is going to be a C tier dungeon. I think this dungeon has one thing in every single pack that will just kill you, right? You have Dark Lash. You have the other ability, I forget what it's even called, that'll just kill you if you don't interrupt it. You have the Goliath Fist that will kill you if you don't interrupt it. The stealth mobs that are in there, they'll just kill your tank if they like stun them. There's just a ton of things that'll just kill your entire group. The second boss was very bad before they nerfed him. There's only 2 spears in the dungeon, so you're virtually doing the entire dungeon without a covenant thing that all other dungeons have. But yeah, I don't know. This dungeon is perfectly fine, especially in Season 2. In Season 3 with the encrypted affix, it's pretty good. But overall, this dungeon is not good. It's very bright. You kind of are required to have the potion, the inky black potion, if you want to, not go blind doing this dungeon. So yeah, it's going to stay in the C tier. It's just a personal opinion. I don't mind the dungeon. It's a pretty average dungeon. It just has a lot of dangerous things that can kill your group and just basically end the key. Theater of Pain is going to be in the B tier. I think Theater of Pain's a pretty good dungeon. For the most part, you can press W in this dungeon and succeed all the way up until like the level 24. You don't even really have to do any interesting skips or anything like that. The worst part about this dungeon is definitely the Necromancer wing. I personally think there's too many interrupts in that wing to basically handle. There's some packs where there are 2 mobs that have very important interrupts while you're also dealing with a 3rd mob like the Elemental. Yeah, honestly, this dungeon's pretty good. I like the Zave wing where you're basically fighting one big mob and you're fighting one big mob and it gives you like 10% of the mob count. Like that's pretty good as well. But overall, this is just a pretty average good dungeon. The bosses are pretty difficult to deal with, but once you know the mechanics, they're pretty easy to deal with. Not easy, but you can deal with them efficiently. There's a lot of strain on your healer in this dungeon in particular, so maybe other healers would have this dungeon ranked lower. But as a tank player, this dungeon is not terribly bad. The last dungeon before Tazavesh, obviously, Sanguine Depth. Sanguine Depth is going to be a D tier dungeon. Everything is bad about this dungeon. Every pack sucks. Every mob in this dungeon sucks. There's too many mobs that do a cast that are important. You're required to have a Curse Dispel. Every boss in this dungeon is one of the worst bosses that were designed in all of Shadowlands. The first boss, second boss, and third boss all are extremely difficult that have very hard-hitting mechanics that will just straight up kill you. Not to mention the affixes negatively affect this dungeon even more than every other dungeon. Sanguine, Quaking, Spiteful, Storming, all these dungeons that basically remove areas of the room make this dungeon extremely hard. So as a result, it's just a D tier. I don't have to really say anything else except for everything went wrong in this dungeon and Blizzard basically could not have fixed it. They could have removed this dungeon from the entire rotation like they did with the Temple of Sothralis for the MDI, and I don't think anyone would have cared. I personally do not think this is anyone's favorite dungeon. If it is your favorite dungeon, let me know below and let me know why, because I don't see any redeeming qualities of this dungeon like at all. Now we're going to get to the Tazavesh dungeons. We're going to start with Streets. I think Streets is a B tier dungeon. It goes along the lines with all the other B tier dungeons. It's a pretty easy, straightforward dungeon to do. It has very hard mechanics to deal with. The first boss is very dangerous. It can kill your tank. It hits pretty hard. The mailroom boss is also very dangerous. You have the council style fight as well, the menagerie, which is very dangerous. Now this is obviously post nerf talking. Pre-nerf Tazavesh Streets would be D tier. It'd be with Sanguine Depths because everything was just terrible about it. I will say though that the B tier, that Streets is not too bad, especially if you go the left route, if you know what I'm talking about, because the dungeon is generally very, very fast. If you go right, it's pretty slow. So I would suggest going left if you are making a route for it. But overall, Streets, pretty good dungeon. I don't really have anything negative to say about it. I like the bosses. I like the it has a cool mini game in the market area. But yeah, pretty good dungeon. Now Gambit is the last dungeon we're going to talk about, and it's so hard for me. I love Gambit as a dungeon. I don't know why, but Gambit is an A tier dungeon. And although it's an A tier dungeon, it has so many things wrong with it. The fish sticks mechanic with the Murlocs is terrible. I don't know why that exists. It should be interruptible, or the cast should be like 3 seconds long, because especially as a monk, I get caught in my GCD so much that I can never interrupt it. I basically just have to AFK and wait for the cast to come out to even cast it. The first boss requires a weak aura to basically do efficiently. You can do it where you type out the colors yourself, or you say it in chat, which is what a lot of high key pushing groups do. But honestly, that makes zero sense for a Mythic Plus dungeon that people are going to pug into. Don't know why that exists. The second boss is the worst designed boss I've ever had to deal with in a dungeon. The bomb should not hit melee. anything like that. The breath is just very interesting. They're in the mechanic, but it doesn't hit them. I don't understand. And then the two Shadow of Zuuls before the final boss, before they got nerfed heavily, are pretty difficult to deal with. They're pretty easy to deal with now, but I thought I would mention them because they are pretty hard hitting. But overall, Gambit is just a good dungeon. Even though it has all these things bad with it, the dungeon is so fast that I can't say anything bad about it, right? Like, it's a super fast dungeon, 3 bosses, you're done. You can do like a 15 in like 10 minutes. It's pretty great. But overall, I think this is where my dungeons are gonna sit for now. Let me know in the comment section down below what you guys personally think of the dungeons. If you agree, disagree with what I'm saying here, let me know what your favorite dungeon is and what your least favorite dungeon is. I'll be interested to see. But if you liked the video, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and check out my other videos on the channel as well. Peace out.